stream. What a wonderful Lenten journey we've been on. Thank you for all of you who are able to attend one or two or now all three of these sessions. It's been a very blessed time. A particular welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening via live stream. We are here with you as well. Thank you for being with us. This man needs no introduction, and anything that I said would make him very uncomfortable. So the only thing I would want to say is that we are so very blessed to have Father Brian here on a regular basis. We're a little spoiled.
Well, good evening. Wow, I'm looking at these. So, well, I'll tell you a story of why I'm, one reason at least, why I'm shy of introductions. So I worked 20 years in Washington on the staff of the Bishops' Conference. And like every staff person, I wrote a lot of speeches that other people gave. And so I had a friend who wrote for a senator from the Midwest. And he wrote for the senator for about 8 years. The senator never thanked him once for any speech, but he also never read a speech before he gave it. So at the end of the 8 years, my friend decided he would manifest his pent-up frustration. So it was during the election. It was during an election year. Senator from the Midwest comes in on a Friday afternoon, picks up the speech, gets in the plane, goes out, steps into a hall with 3 times this many people, and he begins the speech. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you have declining faith in government. I know you think we can neither be efficient nor effective. I'm here tonight to tell you we can be both efficient and effective. I'm here to tell you this is in the middle of the Cold War, the 1980s. I'm here to tell you we can hold down the arms race and not sacrifice our security. We can make new friends among the Arabs and not sacrifice our relationship with Israel. We can hold down unemployment and not do it at the price of rising inflation. And my task tonight is to tell you exactly how we are to do these things." He turned to page 2, and page 2 said, "Good luck, buddy, you're on your own." So introductions can be tricky. So I'm delighted to be part of this series that Father Laughlin and Kelly and the staff have designed. I think they have designed so many different things for Lent to let each of us and all of us find a way to grab hold of different things that deepen the meaning of the season. And I know many of you have read this little book by Pope Francis. Well, he's probably going to be a saint. So I've been asked to give a lot of talks on Francis since he became Pope. Right from the beginning, you know, when you're on the circuit, the way I've been, you get asked to do things again and again. And so I thought the best thing I could do is, this is a very personal book, I think. It is a book that draws on his training. It draws on his basic ideas and his experience. And I thought maybe the most useful thing I could do is to sort of take you behind the book to the person who stands behind it, rather than comment on pages and sections of the book. So that's what I'm going to try and do, is to take you behind the book to the person who wrote it. And so let me begin with what I call the sources of his ministry. Where does he get his ideas? What are the basic convictions he has as he shapes his own understanding of ministry? And I think there are 3 things that stand behind his ministry. First of all, he's a Jesuit. Secondly, he was a Latin American bishop. And thirdly, he's a post-Vatican II bishop. And each one of those has its own kind of shaping influence, in my view, as I watch him. First, he's a Jesuit. So he's schooled in a distinctive tradition within the Roman Catholic Church. It's not the only tradition, it's not the only religious order, but it is a distinctive contribution since the 17th century that has shaped the Jesuit way of understanding things. So the Jesuits have combined spirituality with social justice. They have been great spiritual directors for people throughout the ages unto our own time. They have their own style of spiritual direction. But spiritual direction we think of as in quiet places, in church, in retreat houses, in contemplation and prayer. But the Jesuits have married that to a deep commitment of social justice. And therefore, they have been counselors to kings, indeed, counselors to one of the emperors of China at one point in time. But they've also been patterns of working for and with the poor. They've been theologians and they've been martyrs. And that, out of that rich tradition, Francis is shaped in a certain way. In the opening document that he wrote in the papacy called The Joy of the Gospel, he starts out by what my colleagues at Kennedy School would say he was analyzing the world, describing the world. But the word he used was not analyze. He said we need to discern what's happening in the world, a much more religious category with its own analytical view. And so that's one source of his background training and shaping. And he's never forgotten being a Jesuit, for sure. Some of you may follow it closely enough to know that there's a custom in Rome at Christmas time where the Pope gathers all of the Cori before him. And usually, for most popes, it's been like a Christmas celebration and exchange of best wishes with some reflection on the religious meaning of the event. Francis has used these Christmas talks to do a kind of examination of conscience of anybody working in the Vatican about what he thinks could be things that distort your life, if you will. Your interest is being a careerist rather than being a minister. And so there is a way in which he comes through as the spiritual director, the Jesuit. Secondly, he's a Latin American bishop, and the first bishop from Latin America, and the first bishop from what we today call the global South, which is where the vast majority of the poor in the world live. And that experience of being a Latin American bishop, I think, also shapes his view of things, his way of thinking about things. We all talk today about living in a globalized world, and globalization becomes a term that interprets many things. It's interesting to compare John Paul II's view of globalization with Francis's view. John Paul II thought of globalization as a process. He argued that it can and should be controlled, but in a sense, he started out thinking of it as a neutral process. And then the question was how you set limits to it and gave it direction. Francis doesn't disagree with that, but Francis really doesn't start from an assessment of globalization as neutral. I think he tends to see it in terms of the harms that it can produce. And he is more skeptical about how we're going to control and direct globalization. So the Latin American bishop shapes part of his concern. Thirdly, he is a post-Vatican II bishop. So he was not at the council. Indeed, we're now in a situation where it's very hard to find anyone who was a participant in the council and is still alive. Certainly, if they are, they're retired. But the council affected the church and will affect the church for centuries. And so basic ideas out of the council shape his conception of ministry, of what the church should be. I know in the book he treats at some length his view of synodality, and I know that was part of what you have dealt with already. Synodality has more than one root, but some of the roots are in the council. One of the basic changes of Vatican II was to try, in a sense, to decentralize the Catholic Church, to have less of a focus on Rome and more of a focus on bishops throughout the world with the Pope to guide the church. Synodality, in my view, takes that idea of collegiality and pushes it out to a newer level. So those three things, I think, are thematic, and they stand behind what he is about. How to think about this papacy? In the media, he has attracted, obviously, enormous attention. Early in the papacy, one of the New York Times columnists said, he seems to be the only person that everybody in the world loves. Well, the critics have come out too. But the fact of the matter is, the way that the media talked about Francis was in terms of what came to be called the Francis effect, the Francis impact on things. The difficulty with that is it tended to concentrate on personality characteristics and personal choices. So the Francis effect was that he wasn't going to live in the apostolic palace. He was going to live in basically a hotel that looks like a Courtyard Marriott. I mean, I have been there when I've given talks in Rome. And so that it was that he drives a Ford Focus rather than a limousine. It was that he kind of reduced the tone and style of Vatican liturgies. The difficulty with that is that Francis, I think, would be uncomfortable if that became the way he was interpreted. And so my own view is that rather than talk about the Francis effect, it's important to talk about what I'll call the Francis Project. And what I mean by the Francis Project is that I think what he is about is trying to shape a church over the long term that has the capacity to carry some of his main ideas that I will talk about shortly. So the Francis Project is not about him. It's not even about the church of today. It's about the church of today and what it will pass on to the church that follows. If I had to summarize the Francis Project in one sentence, I would say this is Francis's objective: justice in the world and mercy in the church. Justice in the world and mercy in the church. Keep those ideas in mind and then watch what he says and does, because I think it is this question of building and shaping a church internally and externally, which will be able to carry out the legacy of his own teaching. Although, again, he would resist that personalization of it. But I think he really is very conscious, especially at this stage in his ministry, of what he will leave behind. I think the Synodality Project is meant to go on for 3 years. He is thinking about something that will go beyond his own time. He's already declared that 2025 is to be the year of hope in the world, as he had the year of mercy some years ago. Well, 2025, whether he'll be here or not, like all the rest of us, we're not sure. But he has an idea that he wants to be there as part of the church. Justice in the world and mercy in the church. The next thing to understand Francis, I think, is that you need to watch the way he pairs words and deeds, what he says and what he does. And that started the night he was elected to the papacy. As usual, he came out on the loggia, the balcony at St. Peter's, and the crowds of thousands and thousands waiting for the papal blessing. That's the tradition, his first blessing. Well, he came out, and what he said was, pray for me. Pray for me, and then I will bless you. A little different. Then, in a more concrete fashion, as any good McKinsey counselor would tell you, the way you assess a CEO in part is how he or she uses their time, because time is so important and so scarce. So watching how Francis uses his time is really a good way to assess what he's about. His first visit outside Rome was to Lampedusa. So Lampedusa is a tiny island between Tunisia and southern Europe. And it is the island that the refugees from Africa try to get to, because if they can get to Lampedusa, they're halfway to Europe. And they take enormous risks in order to get there, and then a second set of risks to get them to Europe. And many have not made it. His first place to go was Lampedusa. He then returned to Lesbos, a second tiny island that is on the route of immigration. And so he has been a voice for immigration unlike any other voice in the world. As we know, immigration is both a powerfully moral problem and a very contested reality. And he's been a voice like no one else. But it's what he did that matches what he said in that sense, or exemplifies what he means. Don't forget who these people are. It's another example of words and deeds. Then we're looking at Holy Thursday next week, one of the holiest nights in the life of the church. And on Holy Thursday at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Pope conducts Holy Thursday Mass with the washing of the feet. His first Holy Thursday, he went to a prison and he washed the feet of prisoners, including a Muslim woman. And so it is that he does these things which don't change the life of the prisoners as such, but he does these things in order to put together what he's trying to say and teach, and then exemplify it, if you will, in some of these specific choices. The way he plans trips is another way. First of all, where he chooses to go. He goes to the places that any pope, in a sense, must go to, major capitals in Europe, and a trip to the United States, because the UN is in the United States, so there'll always be, since Pope Paul VI, a trip to the United States. But then if you look at the other places he goes, he often goes to places that do not make the headlines in world politics in any sense of the term. But then when he schedules the trip, it's always interesting. So the Washington trip was interesting. So when he travels as head of state, as well as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. He is received as a head of state. He has a diplomatic corps. And so to each place that he goes, there is the official exchange and greeting. And in the US, it took place in the White House with President Carter, actually. And when he, no, not, excuse me, not with President Carter, President Obama. Sorry about that. I was about 30 years behind. Sorry about that. It's been a long day. So, so he said, so he and President Obama had the formal exchange. It was very powerful and good. And then that event is always followed by a major reception, almost as good as this. I mean, that is where everybody who has a ticket, and you will find people who will kill to have a ticket to an event like that. That's when you move around. He had the major exchange of words, and then he left. He left the reception. He went down the street to Catholic Charities and he had lunch in a soup kitchen. So that was choice. He almost demands that he goes to a prison in most places that he goes to. And so these things are meant to exemplify one of his major ideas. There's the first, justice in the world and mercy in the church. And then under that, there is him calling the church to, in his words, reach out to the existential peripheries. Not exactly an easy thing to say or to understand. He's saying you got to reach out to the edge of the circle of life. And there are existential peripheries at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level. And not everybody can do everything, but he's talking about the whole church, keeping in mind existential peripheries at every level. These deeds find his way into his teaching documents. So now you shift from what he's doing to what he says. It shifts his focus to how he defines the church. So in the first year of the pontificate, he said, what the church should be like today is what he called a field hospital in a very troubled world. Church ought to be a field hospital where people's wounds are bound up. That's part of the work of the church. Once again, trying to shape a practical doctrine of the church. He wants the church to be an advocate and an agent of justice in the world and mercy in the church. So inside the church, there is the declaration of the year of mercy, which I always try and, remind people was never meant to be a 12-month celebration. It was meant to be a year that shaped our capacity for mercy in the church. And he has made a point of reaching out to people who oftentimes have trouble sort of getting inside the circle of the church. He has paid special attention to gay people in many different settings, concerned about the divorced and remarried and access to the sacraments. Interesting enough, he doesn't change doctrine. He finds a way of working around it and through it in so many different ways. So this is, in my view, where he sort of sees things. Justice in the world, mercy in the church as a field hospital, reaching out to the existential peripheries. And a major theme for him is the theme of inclusion. Or to put it another way, what he hates is exclusion. He hates when people are excluded from things that other people have and take for granted. So he's interested in inclusion of an economy. That's the way he describes it. He wants an economy that is inclusive rather than exclusive. But he wants a church that is inclusive rather than exclusive. Now, these are broad themes, and as I say, nobody can do everything, and no one section of the church can do everything, but these are broad thematic ideas. So he, in his own way, has tried to change the working of the church from the inside. And that's interesting how he does things. He can hold things in tension, if you will. He says, he often, when he's talking about political economy, whether it's global or national, he resists what he calls a view of the world that is technocratic rationalism. Well, that's a combination to say, but it is, he just thinks that there's a way of thinking about things that can get to be inhuman. But at the same time, when he confronted, as he became Pope, his predecessor in Pope Benedict was an enormously talented theologian. We'll read Benedict in the church long after he's dead. But he was not a good administrator, and he did not choose good administrators. And so it was the case that if Francis inherited a mess in terms of the Vatican finances and the way they were handled. And so what does he do? Well, he reaches out to McKinsey to come in and do the analysis. Now, if there was ever technocratic rationalism, it's McKinsey. I taught lots of students that, and they're wonderful. They do what they do very well. So he reaches out to them. He reaches out to KPMG, one of the largest accounting firms in the world, to come in and analyze the Vatican. So he can be apprehensive about technocratic rationalism, but he knows people who think that way and need to, and there's a need in the world for some of that too. He thinks it gets out of control, but he clearly has depended on it, it seems to me. So all of these things are an attempt for him to deal with inclusion rather than exclusion, justice and mercy at the same time. So then how do you evaluate him? Well, any pope, I think, and every pope has to be three things in some form. He has to be a pastor, has to be an administrator, and he has to be a diplomat. There's no way around those three major tasks of the papacy. So as a pastor, he needs to be a person of faith, hopefully a mix of intelligence and piety. And there's no question that that's Francis's strongest suit, I think, without doubt. He just has this charismatic quality about him that amazes people outside the church. So let me give you an example of how he's thought about. There are thousands of words that have been written about Francis. But interestingly enough, and I try to follow this pretty closely, interestingly enough, one of the best essays was written immediately after he became Pope, within the first 6 to 9 months. And it was written by the woman who was the editor-in-chief, I think, of Time magazine at the time. She has written more cover stories, you know, the man of the year or the person of the year. She's written more of the essays about the people they chose than anyone else. She's now at the Kennedy School, actually. Nancy Gibbs is her name. And as far as I know, I really didn't know her, but as far as I know, she has nothing to do with the Catholic Church, except she's watched it for a long time. This is the way she described him after 9 months. She said, in his 9 months in office, he has placed himself at the very center of the central conversations of our time about wealth and poverty, fairness and justice, transparency, modernity, globalization, the role of women, the nature of marriage, the temptation of power. And then she goes on, the world is getting smaller. Individual voices are getting louder. Technology is turning virtue viral. So Francis's pulpit is visible to the ends of the earth. When he kisses the face of a disfigured man or washes the feet of a Muslim woman, The image resonates far beyond the boundaries of the Catholic Church. And then she says, in less than a year, he has done something remarkable inside the Catholic Church. He has not changed the words, but he's changed the music, the way it sounds. So as pastor, it is an enormous strength. I don't think he's a great administrator, but I do think he has a sense of where to go, McKinsey and KMPG and others, to get help. I don't think he wants to spend a lot of time administratively, but he uses others as best he can. And then there's the fact of being a diplomat. And I must confess, when he was first named, I thought this third one is the one that is going to be hardest for him, because most popes in modern times have been trained as diplomats. Pius XII had 2 years of pastoral experience, and the rest of his life was in the diplomatic service of the church. John Paul II was many things, but he had the experience of encountering a communist state, and he had to learn how to deal with it. Francis has brought, in his own way, a distinctive style to diplomacy, and I'll come back to it at the end of the talk. But now, take justice in the world and mercy in the church, and let's concentrate on the world. He's adapted, in my mind, 4 broad themes, 4 thematic issues that he deals with. Now, when you study international relations, there are 2 ways to look at how interaction goes on in the world. One way, it's interstate, how states deal with each other. Today, U.S. and Russia, or Russia and Ukraine, etc. Then there are what are called transnational issues. Those are issues that cut across the boundaries of all states. No matter how powerful you are or how rich you are, you can't control everything. If we had perfect environmental control and Canada had terrible environmental control, we'd have bad environment. It just works that way. COVID showed us that it all gets interconnected. So he has chosen primarily 3 transnational issues that touch everybody, that no single state can control, and that everybody has to work together to deal with them. So what are the 3 issues? First, inequality within nations and among nations. Rich and poor within a country, rich countries and poor countries. Second transnational issue is immigration. The third transnational issue is the environment. So they all share these characteristics of touching everybody in the globe, and resolving them requires an incredible amount of collaboration. So inequality. He sees the world through the lens of the poor. That comes through again and again and again. He sees the world through the lens of the poor. He makes a point, because he says that so often, that I love everybody. That's the Pope. I love everybody. But I have to do this and lift up the situation of the poor. And so it is a theme wherever he goes and in all his major teaching. Immigration. He's a pope at a time when there is more movement of human beings than any other time in recorded history. There are more people moving, either because they're forced to move, because they're driven out of their countries, because they're persecuted, or they move because they feel they have a chance for a better life somewhere else. And so they do something that is often painful, and that is to seek that better life. Now, his point is that immigration is a fact that is with us, and therefore we must address it in an attitude of justice and mercy. He says of immigrants, they should be welcomed, supported, and integrated. And he wants the church to work with secular organizations to address this question. We know how difficult it is to get this issue anywhere in the U.S. Congress, anywhere. He put it right on the table in the address to the Congress. But he always has an interesting way of also knocking people off guard when he's driving them crazy because of what he's saying. So remember, when he gave the talk to the Congress, he gave part of the talk over to looking at three people. One was Martin Luther King, one was Thomas Merton, and one was Dorothy Day. So they're all known to us. The funny part about it was the congressman said to me, he said, I heard him about Martin Luther King, and we all knew him. Then he talked about Thomas Merton, and he said some of us who were Catholic knew him. And then because of that accent, I thought he said Doris Day. And I said to myself, where is this going to go? So he has about him a quality of being able to talk about tough issues, but at the same time to spread a little humor. He didn't think he was humorous, but the Congress did. So then you come to the environment. And I think, at least so far, of all that he has said and done as Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, his document on the environment will be his most lasting teaching, as far as I read. There are lots of other things, but that document is extraordinarily well done, extraordinarily well done. He brings his critique of technocratic rationalism against plans for business and organization of the economy in such a way that doesn't take this into consideration sufficiently when he thinks it doesn't. He consulted deeply and broadly in the writing of it, and people who know this material really well respect that document, respect it. The London Guardian, which is a left-of-center newspaper in London, and not known to be either a papal watcher or a papal congratulator, said the text I'm modifying, I'm not quoting it exactly. They said something like the most extraordinary papal document in 100 years. It is his lasting, and what makes it distinctively important is the way he ties the environment to poverty. That now other people do that too. He is not the only one, but he has found a way, again, to take two themes that really interest him and put them together. These are transnational issues, and they touch all, but in different ways. And he is trying to find imagery that helps us to think about what it means to try to solve these problems: immigration, inequality, and the environment. So he keeps talking about our common home that we must share together, or it will go away for all of us. And all of that is part and parcel of what he wants to deal with when he talks about justice in the world. Now come back to the diplomacy question. So this will help bring us up to present time, if you will, because on the whole, what strikes me as I compare him with other popes is that he has not spent a lot of time on what you might call the great powers in the world. He does call on them to be generous, to be creative, to be helpful, but he hasn't spent a lot of time. If you take Pius XII, his whole papacy was consumed by war and the Cold War, and very much consumed by the East-West clash, communism and democracy. John Paul II, coming out of that experience in Poland, was a kind of major statesman-like figure. When I think of those three popes, they kind of illustrate what kind of personalities this church produces over time. It's very interesting. With Pius XII, you have a diplomat and a lawyer. He approached things in legal terms all the time. John Paul II was a philosopher and a statesman. And Francis is a pastor and a prophet. And different kinds of ways of ministering to the life of the church. So most of his diplomacy, I think, has been trying to lift up small states, poor states, have the world both pay attention to them. When he talks about dealing with poverty, whether he's talking about a city or a country or the world, he said it's more than philanthropy. He said it's more than doing positive things that they need. He's not against that. Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, obviously not against it. But he said what it also has to be is creating space at the table for them to have a seat. Because he has a very deep sense of just how creative the poor often are and how underestimated they can be if everything is about philanthropy. So it is about creating space at the various tables of the world, if you will. And this concentration on transnational issues and his choice of where he goes in trips all put that together. So then you come to the fact that he hasn't spent a lot of time addressing the great power issues. Russia, China, the United States. And to some degree, during the last 10 years almost, when he's been Pope, that's been true in the world as a whole. There's been less attention to the great powers and more attention to regional conflicts like the Balkans and Africa and other places. So to some degree, he was in tune with that. But last spring, in my course at Harvard, I used an article that said the return of great power politics. And I thought the person overplayed this because he was saying these are coming back on the scene because transnational issues are about issues that cut across things. Great power politics tend to be interstate politics, interests that clash, policies that clash, and how you make that work. So he hasn't spent a lot of time about that, and I wondered what he would do faced with it. Well, now we know. So Ukraine, Russia, NATO, the United States, this is what is meant by great power politics. And he has his own style of dealing with it. It's not primarily as a diplomat, but it is partially as a diplomat, and it is very much as a pastor. So what has he done? Well, there have been several articles about the fact that while he has called for peace and at the same time has decried the war and decried what was happening in the war, he has not named Putin or Russia by name. The media miss a point. That's a traditional papal style in war. In World War I, Benedict XV as Pope never took a side. In World War II, Pius XII did not name names, and he suffered for it in retrospect, not having named Hitler explicitly, because he was trying to think about Germany rather than Hitler. So in one sense, not naming names is a papal diplomatic church. What popes say is, I've got members of my church on both sides. And if I name names, what will happen to them in the country where I do the critique? That's been the standard argument. There have been a lot of criticism of that, particularly, of course, of Pius XII. But he now is faced with this. So the first thing he did was, once again, it's sort of a matter of style. He broke all diplomatic precedent, because popes, when they want to see a country's representative in the Vatican, they summon them. And usually they have the Secretary of State talk to him. Francis got someone to drive him to the Russian embassy, where the Russian ambassador to the Vatican was. And all he said was, I went in to have a conversation with him about my concerns about this war. Up till that time, people hadn't called it a war. Putin called it a military exercise. He was among the first people, in technical terms, to call it a war. So he did that. He has increasingly come close to criticizing the Russians directly, but his main concern is humanitarian. And on that basis, he had sent 2 cardinals into Hungary and Poland to coordinate the activity there. He's been invited to Ukraine, and the other day he said the invitation is on the table, which means he would go in a minute if they let him go. Now, whether they will let him go, because it raises all kinds of security concerns for other people as well. So I have no doubt that he would go in a minute if people said it wouldn't cause more harm than good, trying to protect him in the midst of all of this. So on the major power question, now on nuclear weapons, he has argued strongly for going to zero, been critical of existing nuclear policy in the US and Russia and China. So he has his way, but my sense is he may have to deal with great power politics more extensively now that now that the world to some degree has changed. So this is my sense of sort of what stands behind the book, which is such a personal reflection, and those are all thematic. And there are lots of criticisms that could be made of 80% of what I just said. So keep that in mind as you think about it. So what happens now? Do we?
Well, I was just wondering if you'd be willing to take some questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the only thing is you're going to have to talk in a way I can hear you. And that's going to be a drag. Yes.
Thank you, Carl. I'm interested in your opinion on how we get from the philosophy to the practice in a Pope who's like to move more from the dogmatic side, more towards the pastoral side. And speaking of people of other faiths who he would consider maybe kind of the periphery and kind of a solution to the problem, given that you've got a cardinalate that many of whom have their heels dug firmly in to the status quo. How do you get from the theory to the practice? Is it by
of course,
benign dictatorship, or is it by power of positive persuasion?
Okay. What he would say in part is, I gotta leave that to the local church. He wants to empower. So he knows that dealing with poverty in the United States is different than dealing with poverty in Brazil. He knows you can't use you don't have the same problem facing you. You have a problem in both places, but you don't have the same. So he would argue strongly that that's what he's trying to set a direction, and he's trying to engage, as I say, he's trying to build a practical model of the church. So, if you give me a semester, I could take each one of those issues and give you an idea of what he thinks about can be done. Yeah, and now, and you're right, he's got cardinals he has tried in the Vatican. First of all, what he's done is to appoint cardinals in places that never had cardinals before. So he's trying to lift up again countries and individuals, and he makes very specific choices. Usually a cardinal is chosen from the capital city in smaller countries. He has particularly chosen in El Salvador somebody who is not the cardinal in the capital city, because this other man represents what he thinks ought to be there. He has tried to bureaucratically bring together these 9 cardinals that are outside the system, if you will, to advise him. Cardinal O'Malley is one of them. There are different ways in which he tries to break through the normal pattern. But to go to the specifics, he's going to depend on the church at every level. Yes.
Similar question, more in terms of thinking around doctrine. How can this Pope lead the church in inclusion in the Pope is going from up against theologies of ordination and Eucharist? How is he going to make inclusion?
Exactly.
In terms of doctrine, how can you, when there is a certain level of structure in doctrine, how are you going to work around when it comes to inclusion with things like Eucharist and ordination?
Yeah, when we talk about this Pope bringing mercy into the church, he's going to come up against the reality of doctrine, the centuries of doctrine, on things like particularly.
So specifically about Eucharist, what are you referring to?
Well, how can gay people receive the Eucharist?
Okay,
How
access to the
How can
sacraments.
divorced Catholics receive the Eucharist? How can people who are outside of the mainstream be brought to the table literally?
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. That is not a simple question to solve in this church, because we are structured. We are structured from the bottom up to the top. So it depends. He has had 3 synods, and one of them was on the family. Has a question about divorce, remarriage, and access to the sacrament were a major concern with that synod. And he couldn't create consensus. He couldn't bring out what you've got sitting there in a synod is, roughly 300 bishops or so, representing the whole world, because each country sends 1 or 2. And so you have 300 to 500 bishops. He couldn't create a consensus, and so he didn't try to force it down anybody's throat. One idea, he had said many things that seemed to be that he would like to find some flexibility on that, and he kind of left it as an open question, but he doesn't. Now, if you take a question like ordination, on that one, he feels bound by the previous teaching, and he said so. And I think he probably will not return to that as an issue. The first issue he may well return to. He can find a way through it. Because he doesn't want to, and I think rightfully so, he doesn't want to create an image of the church that says yes, you get enough pressure and you say no, or vice versa, you say no and you get enough pressure and you say yes. He doesn't want to do that. But he does want to leaven the life of the church with mercy. So then it's a question of how best to do it. But you're right on target, as this gentleman. You take those 2 questions, how do you go from the general principle to the particularity of the situation? How do you go from tradition hundreds of years old, but still open to modification? How do you get to modify? That's a pretty good example of what queries run up to get.
Ordination seems a missed opportunity with this Pope, because we're really just half a generation away from not having a priesthood. So how does this Pope lead us in the future?
How does he lead us in the future? Well, he's 83, I think he's close to 85. So I think his time is short. His legacy is pretty well set.
looking into the ordination of the diaconate of women, which is something that has been formerly in the church. It's the foundation of of what the Catholic Church is. And we've had two groups at the Vatican, he invited them in to look at the historicity of it and look at the tangibility of it happening again. So, of course, glacial was the word that has been used. That's the way the church used, but I think he is making some very strategic moves. He's also placing women in roles in the Vatican that have never been held, not just by women, but by lay people either. So he is opening pretty massive doors to that within the confines.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, now I'm here.
Yeah, Father, would you just make it clear? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding among access to the Eucharist to a divorced Catholic. If I understand correctly, if you're divorced, you are allowed to receive the Eucharist
Absolutely.
unless you remarry outside the church.
That's what the teaching is. Right. And what the lady is referring to is the debate is about, can
Yeah.
you move that one step further? But
I
that's-
just didn't want anyone to
You're absolutely
misunderstand.
right. You're absolutely- They never have me teach doctrine.
Does anyone
Well,
else
that's
want
your
a final
bad.
question? Anybody else want a final question before we finish? Yeah.
Has he ever written about his experience in Cordova?
I think he has, in different ways, or people close to him have, I don't know. Cordova he had a difficult period of time when he was appointed the provincial of the Jesuits in his early 30s. And he says it was madness to do that, given the kind of decisions provincials have to make, and given the fact that he was in a country that was basically on the edge of war internally. He was really exiled, if you will. He was exiled into this Jesuit institution in Cordova. He was not outside the country. He was inside. People have written about it. He has commented about it. Whether he spent a lot of time talking about it, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think if you read this man Austin Iverly is an English academic, and he's probably, he's very positive about Francis. I mean, and I think you'll find some of it there in that book. And another book by a man named Valor is also helpful. But a systematic approach, I don't know. Okay, I don't want to stand in the way.